Okay, it's going.
Great. Well,
So,
again, welcome everybody. I want to introduce Dr. Rachael Powers. She's an associate professor and the graduate director in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida. She has a master's degree in criminology from the University of Maryland, which she got in 2008, and went on to receive her doctoral degree in criminal justice from the University at Albany in 2012. And a lot of Dr. Powers' work is on violent victimization, public perceptions of crime and domestic violence. And today we're going to discuss two of her recent articles. One appears in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, titled Social Learning Theory, Gender and Intimate Partner, Violent Victimization, Structural Equations Approach. And the second article we'll be discussing is in the Journal of Crime and Justice, and that one is titled The Impact of Situational Context on Assault Completion, the Moderating Role of Relational Distance. And two students from my class here, Tyler Causer and Steph Padrone, will talk with Dr. Powers a little bit and ask some questions regarding those two articles, as well as some more broader questions on the research in general. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler and Steph.
can I ask the basic question? What got you interested in IPV?
Yeah, sure. I actually, I think I came to academia and criminology in a weird way. I did my undergrad in psych and soc with a minor in women's studies. And originally I was going to go to grad school to be a counseling psychologist and then work with victims. And quickly realized that I was not going to have a homework divide and it was going to eat me alive to be on the practitioner angle, right? But I knew I wanted to still work with, victims in some way. So that's, basically how I wound up in academia instead of a practitioner. And I started my master's under Sally Simpson. And if you know of her work, she does some gender IPV work or gender work, and then she does some white collar work. And, basically she had this data set that she put in front of me and said, this is what you're doing your master's thesis on, go figure it out. And that set me on my entire career path. It was really a little more happenstance than.
Has that cross-discipline background helped you?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. I am a very strong proponent of criminology being not just a subset of sociology, but truly an interdisciplinary degree. Most of my work, and especially my recent work, really takes more of a public health approach, right? Instead of offenders are bad people and we need to do things to them. More of a understanding of the systemic disparities and how those all interact to create health outcomes, right? So absolutely getting outside of criminology and having an interdisciplinary background has been completely ideal for me.
I know that was really interesting because when I read your SLT article, it reminded me so much of sociology that I was like, okay, that I can actually understand this well enough. Are there cross-discipline is cross-discipline examinations common in criminology, or because I feel like they focus so much on outside factors affecting the individual that there's no inner processes. There's a lack of the qualitative studies that study that.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. We need to do much more of that. Draw from the, ideally what I really fell in love with criminology is the idea that we can pull from the best of all disciplines, right? We can pull from the fancy stats of economics, and we can pull from the high quality research in sociology, especially the qualitative research, and we can pull from poli-sci. And we don't do a great job of doing that in practice, but in theory, it's wonderful, right? And we should do more of that, because you read the article with social learning theory. Mm-hmm. And criminologists say, ooh, social learning theory, look at this amazing thing that we came up with. And you read that and you're like, are you sure you came up with that? Because that sounds like, 5 other sociology theories, right? And you do that with life course as well. You can read, and it's not to say that these people aren't making a huge impact, but you read Moffat's work or Loft's work. And he was one of my professors about turning points. And they're like, this is revolutionary. But if you have a psych background, you'd be like, well, actually, we were those are theories based on things in the 40s. Like those aren't revolutionary now.
Yeah, there's like this whole literature on it, and I'm like, you should draw on that, and maybe it can inform it.
Exactly, right? It feels like it's a different name put to a theory that already existed. So we need to do a much better job of integrating those literatures instead of playing catch up and then pretending we're revolutionary because of it, right?
Do you know why like qualitative studies haven't been done more in the field?
Yeah, that is, and we're changing. But there has been a bias against qualitative research for a long time, actually. People assume that it's less rigorous, that it's more aligned with journalism than it is with research, right? That research somehow has to be very fancy with statistics. And I'm saying this as someone who's a quantitative researcher, right? But that doesn't mean qualitative research is less rigorous. It's rigorous in other ways. But there's been a historic bias in criminology to pull from those sexy, economics equations and to the detriment of really understanding lived experiences, right? I think we're changing. I think we're changing a little bit because mixed methods is now the sexy term everyone wants to do. And I think that'll usher in a wider appreciation for qualitative research. And I think that the next generation of criminologists that are coming up are more interested in qualitative research than generations past. And so I think it'll be a bit of a generational replacement. When all the rest of us super big quant jocks die out, it'll be a little bit more
Hopefully
mixed.
not.
When we retire on our yachts, it'll be, so I think it's changing, but there's been a bias against qualitative research for a long time in many fields, sociology less so, but it's a field problem.
Oh, it's a whole field problem. That's interesting. Are there like qualitative studies that you do want to see in IPV?
Yeah, definitely. I think in part, I think where qualitative research can really shine is taking that intersectional approach. And you might know that word, right? So when and this came out of Black feminist theory, right? Where we have this idea that men and women are different, they experience things different. But the thing is, we can't just say this is what about gender or this is about race, right? People occupy multiple identities, and those multiple identities inform everything from from the dynamics of violent encounters, the risk of violent encounters, how they handle those, the closure they seek, formal help seeking, and everything is informed by multiple identities, right? We're not just gender, we're not just race, we're not just sexual orientation. All of these come together. Understanding how that informs dynamics of violent encounters, the agency that people exert in violent relationships, and what they do afterwards, and their support systems. I think disentangling all of that from an intersectional approach requires qualitative research. You can't really get really into that with closed-ended survey questions. So I think that's what we really need to do.
I think the only issue is just that qualitative, it's not generalizable. And so
Yeah, it's not generalizable, absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily need to be generalizable. Qualitative research really shines because it digs down and it helps you understand the underlying processes of phenomenon. Whereas, quantitative research, it's hard to get at that, right, with closed-ended questions. So it isn't generalizable, but doesn't necessarily need to be. I don't think qualitative research is an appropriate strategy to use solely to evaluate a program when that program might be then implemented in other places. Now, it has a place in eval research, right? So not to suggest that it doesn't have a relevant place. But for other types of questions, really getting at lived experiences, their internal thought processes and decision-making strategies and their support and how, those types of things and how they play out, I think that's where qualitative research really, really shines.
Ew. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm the only one talking. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Tyler, do you want to jump in with yours?
No, I just have a question. Since the pandemic, how do you think that's affecting IPV? Like, is it affecting best ways to address the increase or decrease that we haven't seen in IPV? in the public view?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When this pandemic, when it hit, the World Health Organization released a really good statement about IPV, kind of worldwide. There's a couple of mechanisms by which it may increase IPV, and part of that is economics and status incompatibility. So I'm talking about male on female violence right now. So as men are losing jobs, we know that the inequality economics in the household and status incompatibility can be a catalyst for violence, right? So that's a problem. We also know that just stress, right? So IPV is a very heterogeneous construct, right? Sometimes it's motivated out of power and control. Sometimes it's motivated by stress, and there's a lot of variation in there. But stress is a motivator, and so we have a lot of stress in households right now. So there are some things that might serve as a catalyst to increase the use of violence and the severity of violence. And then we took what is normally considered a private type of victimization and we made it super private because there's no support systems right now, right? People can't leave their houses safely. People can't go to their family, to their friends, to their churches, to all of these informal social support systems that we normally think of. Victims aren't able to access those, right? And we know that accessing informal social support systems and the response that people give from family, friends, clergy, that kind of stuff is key to whether they're actually going to go to formal support systems like the police and get out of there, right? So we've knifed off a mechanism by which law enforcement is likely to be aware and become involved into these relationships. So it is certainly taking a bad problem and exacerbating it on multiple fronts. After the pandemic is over, I mean, I don't know if it'll go back to normal. The economy is going to take a long time to recover. But hopefully those social support systems will be there.
Are there building on that, are there any specific services that we should know about to kind of help people in violent relationships?
Definitely.
Other than the police and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, most communities, not necessarily in rural areas, but most communities will have domestic violence shelters. You're not going to be able to look it up and get an address, but they will give you a phone number, right, where they can interact with the victim. I would suggest before, you don't want to just put a phone number in front of somebody. I would try to find out what local shelters you have, whether they accept children, and if so, what ages and genders of those children. Sometimes they don't take male children over the age of blank. A lot of these, fortunately, are only take victims and they won't take male victims. And so, and that's, male victims of IPV are very underserved. Often in communities, there is no shelter for them. They don't eat, or they have, a bed in a separate room of, a shelter for women. So figuring out if they take men and women, if they take children, and if so, what ages and genders, and if they take pets. So we understand now that pets actually serves as a barrier to leaving, right? In the same way children do. If shelters aren't going to accept pets, the victim has a choice to stay in the house with their pet or leave without their pet. And oftentimes that's, a decision where people choose to stay because of. So I would definitely figure out what that looks like, that immediate social support system. And then, what programs there are. There's a lot of barriers to people leaving. Some of that is financial, right? If they're relying on the abuser for finances. There is some programs in some communities like Dress for Success, where they'll work with them to get them interview outfits, work with them on interview skills, get them transportation to try to remove that financial barrier. Obviously, counseling, group counseling, and individual counseling. Some communities offer that for free for IPV victims. So just understanding what is out there, because it's not as simple as leave your house, come crash on my couch, and then figure out a new life, right? There's so many barriers to leaving. And that's why victims leave on average about 7 times, right? They leave and they go back and they leave and they go back. And then it takes about 7 times before they actually are able to break free. Because they're pulled back. I mean, and not to even mention the fact that, at one point they were in love with this person, right? So besides all the logistical barriers, there's an emotional barrier there. So being able to provide those resources and support, and know that you might put a lot of effort into helping this victim and they go right back to the abuser. And that's not the time for tough love, I'm cutting you out, right? That's the time to keep giving them that support, right? Because it's a really hard process. It's not a kind of binary decision where all of a sudden they get to leave. It's a process, right? Of them accepting the fact that they can get out of that relationship and have a life outside of that abusive relationship.
Oh, quick question regarding the males. You said some of them don't accept men. Would they still accept male children at least? Or
Debatable,
Mhm.
debatable. So some shelters don't accept men at all. Actually,
Oh,
most shelters don't accept men. It's really aimed at women who are victims, which is a problem. It's a huge
mhm.
problem, right? But you know, historically, we just assume men aren't victimized, and if they are, it's not traumatic for them somehow, right? Like they can just leave because they're men, you know. But and shelters that accept women oftentimes won't accept male children over a certain age, right? Usually it's an age of adolescence and above, and they cite it as a safety risk, or you know, that women feel unsafe being in a shelter with, you know, men like, or children who are almost adult age. This varies by shelter. There's really no hard and fast rules, or certainly no laws surrounding this, but it's really big considerations for someone who's trying to leave and trying to leave safely with their children.
Oh my
I was
God.
going to piggyback off that. Tyler, you had a question that you sent, and I think it was a really good one too, and it kind of piggybacks off what we were just talking about. And is, you know, why do you think that you know, not only these other things that we just mentioned in terms of getting into a shelter, but reporting itself is generally less for men. And why do you think that is? Is there some sort of societal issue that limits reporting for men? How do we get better representation, particularly to do this in practice, but also to include them in our studies?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a really good question. There is a huge problem, right? So, you know, victimization of men is, and this is for IPV and for sexual violence, is wrapped up inherently in ideas of masculinity, and homophobia, actually, right? So people think that, for example, men who are raped must be physically weak and likely gay, right? So obviously that precludes reporting. In a similar way, IPV, people assume that men who are victims of IPV must be feminine or weak, right? Because how did you let a woman overpower you? Or if they accept that victimization actually is a thing, we often assume that men are unfazed by victimization, right? As if somehow, you know, the fists of women are made out of cotton candy and it's not really that big of a deal to be punched by a woman, right? Even though we know that they can do substantial harm, right? So we just assume that men aren't victimized, but that they're also supposed to be stoic and unfazed, right? They're not allowed to have psychological distress when they're victimized. They're supposed to shake it off, right? In the same way that they're supposed to shake off trauma of all forms, right? And then so what happens is that a victimization of men doesn't wind up just being you know, an assault on their person, but an assault on their gender identity for cisgender men, right? And that is hard, and that becomes a huge barrier to reporting. So add all of that onto the fact that when they do report, they have access to a lot less services than women do.
Uh, Going back to the children stuff, you know, like let's see, same sex like couples, like when they go to shelters, is it common for like their abusers as females to go in with them, or like or
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, we oftentimes the person who goes into the shelter, if it's same sex, they will not put the other person in there, right? Even if it's a mutually combative relationship, right, where they're both hitting on each other, they won't put them in there together. Typically, when a victim goes into the shelter, the offender won't know the address of that shelter. They often either move through buildings or they just try to keep the address very secret, right? Or the phone number secret so that they can't show up, right, unannounced. But it is an issue, right? And same-sex IPV, as we were talking about reporting, is vastly underreported for different reasons and similar reasons. We know victimization between same-sex individuals are vastly underreported because for so long they had to portray the relationship as ideal, right? Grant me marriage, you know, our relationships are amazing. So they didn't want to acknowledge the fact that there's actually violent conflict in relationships, even though it's ridiculous to think that they would be somehow immune to IPV. But in the fight for marriage equality, it was that we have to portray our relationships as ideal and have a community of silence surrounding IPV. And so that's an additional barrier to accessing services and police that they still face in same-sex couples. We don't have really good estimates of same-sex IPV. We think it's comparable. It makes sense that it's comparable, but we don't have much really, really good data on that.
That's really interesting. I wonder if IPV is more common among lesbian or gay couples. That would be an interesting, sorry.
No, it would be. And, there's some research out there on it, but the samples are usually very small, right? So the sample, because it's difficult, right? There's no nationwide survey of IPV of same-sex couples, right? So they're often very like clinical samples, like shelter samples, or very small samples in a small geographic region, that kind of stuff. And sometimes when they do that, they just say, okay, here's our straight estimates, and then here's like the LGBTQ estimate, as if there's no variation in that community, right? And that's obviously a problem then, because it could be, if we think about intersectionality, right, you're not just sexual orientation, you are gender and sexual orientation. So not disentangling that group is a problem. But oftentimes research doesn't. They just say, here are straight folks and here is everybody else.
That's nice.
Yeah, and a question I think that we can probably wrap up on that I think was really interesting, and Steph asked this sort of at the bottom here, is that, as researchers, there's a couple things, is that sometimes we get wrapped up into, like we mentioned, the statistics and writing about this from a very sort of detached area. So again, Steph said, insight into how someone can avoid becoming detached. But as you mentioned earlier too, I think there's also the issue of getting wrapped up in the research, especially qualitative research, where this begins to have a toll on you as well. And there is some sort of, as much as we try to be objective, there is an attachment, once you start to understand and deal with individuals. So I would say, how would you suggest that we can avoid becoming so detached that everyone's a number, but not also having such close attachments where our mental health begins to suffer as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those are really good points. I think, so addressing the how not to become detached first, and I reflected on that, and I think, because it's not a question you're normally asked. You're normally asked, like, how are you not jumping off a bridge? Like with all the trauma that you deal with every day. And honestly, I think how not to become detached, and this sounds cliche or disingenuous, but it's not, is the teaching aspect, right? So I do, is there something? Oh, okay. Gotcha, sorry, that just popped up. So, for researchers in this area, you work with statistics and you work with studies and you just do it all day in and day out. And it's kind of easy to start to see things as my latest model, my latest publication, my latest whatever, right? But then you go into a classroom and you feel a little desensitized, and you teach students and you see the horror on their face. You see when you say things that you think that everyone knows and that are commonplace and it's revolutionary for them, or it gets them to think about things in another way, or it incites them to act or do their own research or become activists. It's when you're in the classroom, you're reminded that these are victims and that there's people behind each number, right? And so I really think it's the students that help out with that tremendously, and to avoid being detached. It's really teaching. They say for academics that your teaching should inform your research and your research should inform your teaching. And I think that's actually really true. It is with the students that you are allowed to, you're reminded about why you do what you do, kind of stuff. So that's how not to be, to pull in from being detached. We deal with trauma, and that's awful. And, so for me, as I said before, like, I knew I couldn't work with victims one-on-one. I couldn't be the one responsible for their closure, because I knew it was just going to eat me alive, right? I was going to be that person that did nothing else ever in my entire life except for go to the ends of the earth for each individual person. And I just learned that about myself. And so that's, but I can do other things, right? Because I'm really good at math and I'm really good at policy. But, still working with victims, and especially in qualitative research or even in interviews, and you feel for them. And that trauma comes home with you because you feel helpless, right? And so I think a couple of things is making sure exercising self-care, you have to have a work-life balance, right? We have this culture in academia where everyone's just supposed to work all the time and never do anything outside of work, and that's problematic for mental health for a number of reasons. So having that work-life balance, finding things that you enjoy that maybe aren't crime documentaries, because we have this problem in criminology where then our leisure becomes like horror novels and like crime documentaries, and then you're just still just living it, right? You're still like just living everything. So having hobbies outside of all of that is important. And then, you know, the great thing about academia or researchers is that we form networks with each other, right? So there's like overlap between me and Dr. Pasik's work. And so, you know, like forming networks and social support systems of people is really important for exercising that self-care as well. So getting away from your desk, doing something super fun, and also relying on emotional support from your colleagues, I think is the best way to handle that trauma. Otherwise, it will come home with you and it will haunt you every day.
Thank you. Because I did research into rape cases in India, and the details I couldn't keep up with it. I was just I can't do this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's difficult. It's difficult. And then, you know, and you're requested oftentimes to take these people's lived experiences and somehow aggregate them up into this very impersonal number, right?
Exactly.
Feels wrong, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a balancing act, and it's difficult. But and knowing your boundaries is really important, right? Knowing where your boundaries are as a person for getting involved, and your, you know, emotional boundaries as well.
All right. Any final questions here as we come up on sort of 30 minutes here?
This is where would you like to see IPV like move towards in the future? And like,
yeah, a couple of different things. I think, you know, we have some holes in our research, and holes kind of in our fundamental thinking. I think for one, I would like to see IPV research move more towards adolescence, right? And I know that's been a theme of your class, and it's so needed. And we're moving towards that with the acknowledgement that adolescents experience and perpetrate IPV, and their attitudes and their behaviors are relevant for understanding and developing primary prevention programs early on. Like, we know these problematic attitudes and behaviors start quite early. I don't know if you guys saw, you know, that coercion wheel, the wheel of violence for coercion. And you look at those behaviors for adolescents, and they're normalized, right? They're normalized. We think that Twilight is a cute movie and romantic. And then, but if you look at it from an IPV researcher lens, you're like, holy crap, all the red flags, someone get that woman out of there. Like, what the hell? So we normalize these behaviors in adolescence, and then, you know, they escalate and translate into adult relationships. So more emphasis on younger adults, I think, is absolutely necessary. But the other big hole in IPV research, where I've tried to do some work with regard to self-protective behaviors, is that no agent, that they're somehow these in like punching bags, right? That they don't do things in their relationship to negotiate that violence, right? And I think understanding what people do in violent relationships is key to developing better prevention and intervention programs on the victimization side, right? We know through qualitative interviews how victims try to minimize or mitigate that violence, right? But we don't know enough about all of that. And so I think that's really necessary for the field to move forward in IPV research, and develop theories that are maybe based specifically for IPV or for victimization. So, and I'm guilty of this because you read one of my articles. We often take theories aimed at explaining criminal offending and just throw them at victimization, right? Social learning theory was not developed for victimization, but you know, there are no theories developed at victimization. And normally our theories to explain gender-based violence are just general theories that we've thrown at gender-based violence and hoping that they'll work. So we need to be more thoughtful in developing theories that are aimed at that type of violence, because it's not the same as armed robbery.
That's interesting.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, let's yeah, we'll end it there. Steph, if you want to
And
stop recording now.
Mm-hmm.